Hi. I was just admiring some of my weapons from my collection from when I was known as a warrior many years ago, back in my old U.S. Marine Corps days long ago. And speaking of days long ago, well, I want to welcome you all to another edition of Farmhouse History. I'm Scott Schultz, again joining you from the beautiful confines of my old farmhouse's library in the hilly countryside of modern-day Wisconsin here in the good old United States of America. While there's plenty of history to talk about in such an historic mansion as this, today's episode's going to take us back a couple thousand years to the time of Sparta and the incredibly brave and beautiful Spartans' battles to stave off the evils of their Persian enemies. Now, many of us have learned about the movie 300, in which Spartan King Leonidas heroically leads 300 Spartan warriors into battle against those Persian hordes in the Battle of Thermopylae. And today, we'll learn about the story 301, which adds just a little bit of a twist to that movie 300. Now, it's the holiday season, and that stirs most of us to try to find a gift for our loved ones. And a couple of years ago, one of the gifts my dear wife gave to me was a DNA test to check on my ancestry, to see what my ancestry is all about. I've always wanted to dig a little bit more deeply into that, just as so many folks want to do. And I was surprised through my DNA testing to find out that my German name, which is spelled Schultz, Schultz, actually originally was a Polish name spelled Szolc, also pronounced Schultz. But the magic of that testing went much further back in my history. And it went all the way back, believe it or not, to the time of the Spartans. I know that's hard to believe because, well, that was a long time ago after all. But it told me about one of my most famous and most underappreciated ancestors. An ancestor by the name of Gluteus Maximus. Now, good old Gluteus Maximus was an unheralded trainer and a king of all things, or rather an advisor of all things, to King Leonidas. Now, King Leonidas loved and respected Gluteus Maximus, in good part because of the special physical training that they shared, and also because Gluteus Maximus could weave a good tale that brought some occasional humor to the otherwise all too serious Spartan aristocracy. Now, this is all in the information that my Ancestry.com information has dug up, and they were kind enough to share this with me, and I'm sharing it right directly with you. Now, that penchant that Gluteus Maximus had for his humor was rather unpopular with many in that society because, that brought about his occasional bouts of buffoonery. And indeed, he became, well, the butt of many Spartan jokes. Now, despite that unpopularity, King Leonidas' wife, Queen Gogo, seemed to revere Gluteus Maximus. She often was even known to walk behind her husband's beloved trainer advisor, her eyes turned slightly downward as she'd quietly say, "Oh, Gluteus Maximus, you bring delight that I could follow to the edge of the world." Well, old Gluteus Maximus, like so many of his time, came from a long line of warriors. He was the same age as Leonidas, and in their youth he found the king to have a slight penchant for laziness when it came to do training required to become a real Spartan warrior. "I'm the great Gluteus Maximus, and I'm demanding that you get off your butt to train with me," he often told Leonidas, according to this writing. Now, Leonidas, of course, took the pushing to heart and eventually would take his place among the greatest and most brave of Spartan soldiers and warriors. Gluteus Maximus, at the same time, slid more into the background as Leonidas took that place as Sparta's king. But he never lost Leonidas's trust or his ear. Now, that relationship was no different in the days leading up to the fateful Battle of Thermopylae. It was Gluteus Maximus who was the most vocal of those supporting Leonidas in taking his brave crew of 300 personal protectors and lead them, along with a somewhat ragtag force of several thousand from other Greek city-states, to head off what some estimated to be 1,000,000 Persians at what was known as the Hot Gates. Though the action was taken without the required approval of Sparta's council, Gluteus Maximus, like his friend Leonidas, believed that the show of the small force's brave stand against that vast Persian force would force the council to approve loosing the broader army to take a greater stand against those horrible invaders. Now, historians have noted that the small Spartan force held off wave after wave of Persian attackers, those invaders the most dishonorable and freakish in nature and appearance. It was good against evil. And just as in the greatest of war movies ever created, the good ultimately won, though at a cost of the king's life. Such a stand by the heroic Spartans would motivate societies through a couple thousand years of history to also realize the righteousness in their causes, no matter how ill-fated. History shows us time and again how militaristic societies always do what they do best. They go to war. That's what warriors do, after all. And coincidentally, generation after generation of those righteous warriors so often had advisors so similar to my great ancestor, Gluteus Maximus, to push them all into battle. Now, Leonidas and many of his brave Spartan warriors forfeited their lives on that battlefield so that their state's people could live in the ways that were familiar to them, free in ways only free people who state their class above the dregs of citizens useful only as slaves and servants could ever know. But while those others forfeited all for Sparta's cause, Gluteus Maximus survived. There's no documentation other than this family lore found as evidence, but Gluteus Maximus reportedly went on to run a lucrative enterprise of manufacturing weapons of war, and continuing through the rest of his mortal time to continue to counsel kings about the importance of going to war for all that's good and righteous. That goodness and righteousness, of course, always was on the side of the kings he counseled, those kings who always were the best customers for his swords, shields, and spears. Gluteus Maximus became less than a footnote in ancient Mediterranean history, and but for that DNA test, he'd never been known in my family's history. His legacy, however, has lived on in every society's military-industrial complex. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Farmhouse History, and please join us for our next episode, Rome Stumbles. In the meantime, I'm going to put away my weapons of war, and I invite you, in the name of Gluteus Maximus, to do the same. Thanks again for joining me in this great adventure that's not necessarily all factual.